Because I don't believe we're going to see the things that that prophecy foretells, because it's all about, oh yeah, yeah, God's eyes on America. America's all going to be great again. And we're going to go
Yes.
back to the founding fathers. The founding fathers were mostly Masons. So it's like, do you want to go back to a Freemasonry running the world or running the US? No, I don't think that's a good idea. So, what is it? What people are looking for? The whole country was based on violence. People taking the West, getting rid of the Native Americans, all of this stuff, that's the history. Is that a good history? Same with the British history. Is that God's way of doing things? No, he's a
No.
God of peace.
Yeah.
So we can't say that the history of any nation was how God intended it to be. Great Britain conquered most of the world at one stage. Is that what God wanted for us? Absolutely not. And for us to call ourselves Great Britain is pride and arrogance. And to make America great again is pride and arrogance, because it was never great in the first place. Neither was Britain great in the first place, because we were all doing things contradictory to peace and God's kingdom. We were doing it the worldly way. We were doing it following a method of, we're going to take over the world, we're going to plant our flag, we're going to control this, and yes, most of it has gone away from war, but now it's operating on economy, operating on other things, doing the same thing. We're going to control the world economic stuff. We're going to do it this way now rather than violence, but there's still violence. So you still have the wars and everything else. So I don't personally believe that that is God's intention ever. When Jesus said, love one another and forgive one another, that doesn't give any excuse for violence. So if we are operating violently in any way, it's contradictory to God's kingdom, which is not a kingdom of violence. And I know people will quote, yeah, but the violent take the kingdom by force. Yeah, but that doesn't mean it's what God wanted. If we try and do things in our own way. Now, if it's the passionate and the intensely committed that establish God's kingdom, yeah, absolutely. And you got to look at, well, what was the original words that were used and what were they referring to? Were they referring to the overthrow of the old and the establishing of the new? Probably. When you look at covenantally, the old covenant was coming to the end. And because they didn't follow Jesus, there was a judgment of the old covenant system, and that came to an end violently. But Jesus warned them that they could escape the violence, but they perpetuated the violence by trying to overthrow Rome politically and military wise, which is why Rome came to attack Israel and Jerusalem, because they were rebelling against Roman rule, which was a political spirit in operation, backed up with the religious spirit that was behind it all as well. So, that's history. And I don't believe God ever intends us to use violence to fulfill his kingdom. It is a mindset based on our belief of what is going to happen in the
Yeah.
future that can definitely taint the way you bring prophecy. What about the pastor a couple of years ago who came out with the whole thing about civil war in America and China and Russia being on America's soil? All based again on, well, Jesus is going to come and rescue us. These aren't consistent, are they? If
Yeah.
God said one thing and says something totally opposite, and I could probably go out there and trawl prophet land and find something totally opposite to that.
Yes.
Because I've heard prophecies, hey, judgment is coming on America big time, and it's going to be this, that, and the other because of its stance on abortion and all this stuff. And you had stuff in the Lancaster conference a number of years ago with Sundar Severa Singh or whatever he was called, and he prophesied this
Yeah.
judgment coming, and then you've got California is going to fall to the sea, into the sea of earthquake, and it's like, well,
It's way so much.
all these things I believe are coming out of people's own thoughts, understanding, whatever. And if God is saying something, then they're not interpreting what he's saying correctly in that way. Now, I'm not saying whether this is a correct prophecy or not. And, just because something was accurate in one way doesn't necessarily mean that the whole thing, because it says we prophesy in part. And often that is the case. God says something and warns us, usually so it doesn't happen,
Like,
generally.
part of prophecy, as I read, is also, isn't it supposed to be edifying to build you up?
Yeah, it
So in
is.
other words, if I listen to that, like my son is like, oh gosh, my job, and I'm gonna. His prophecy wasn't one that if I was listening to it and I was a young parent, making that to me on survival mode, I'd be going, oh, what am I gonna do? My
Yeah.
wife's at home
Yeah.
with the
Oh, yeah, I
kids.
understand. And yeah, it says New Testament prophecy is about consolation, comfort, and edification. And does that comfort and edify? Does it console? Um, you
And
can
we're all gonna
you
be
can
screwed
read
for
in.
a while.
Yeah. It depends really on what your mindset and view is, because you can read into anything. Oh yeah, God's comforting us because he's saying this is not going to be the end and it's going to bring good,
But
you
it's
know.
gonna be really dark, like we've
Yeah.
never seen on the earth.
But in a sense, I'm not disagreeing with that reality from one perspective, in that I do believe that what we have created in our systems are not going to last the test of time, and they will eventually crumble and fall. And if they do, there may be a period where things are not operating in the comfort and ease that we've been used to in the West. So if that happens, um, does that mean that God wants chaos and anarchy and everything else? No, but we have to transition out of something old into something new at some point. And the old never want to let go of their power control positions. So usually something shakes it and it eventually falls and crumbles. And every empire that has come out of that empire spirit, following a Luciferian agenda for one world government, all of that empire spirit, eventually all the empires crumble. You go back to the very earliest empires and you've got Babel and their desire to establish a name for themselves, and you follow all the way through history and you can see there were different peoples that rose up, the Sumerians, and then you have the Assyrians, and you've got the Babylonians, and all of these people, Chaldeans. They all had, but they were generally fairly contained in the Middle East area. We're not talking about worldwide, but as it got bigger and transport and things got easier, then things started to expand. And you had, like, Genghis Khan had a huge empire, all out of war, and he killed, millions of people, you know, and all of that stuff on the basis of creating an empire in his name, and the same for other empires going forward right throughout history. None of them were peaceful. And none of them were about God's glory. They were all about establishing a name for ourselves. The British Empire, establishing a name for themselves. There was nothing about God in there whatsoever. Now, did God use it to bring some message of Jesus out? Yes. But actually, was that message tainted with a whole lot of other stuff? Yes. So we exported all sorts of Victorian values that some people are still living under, thinking it's God's kingdom, and that's not really the message. So I do believe that the systems that we've developed will be shaken and they will come to nothing, and people will come to a realization that they're not the answer. And I think that does include the religious, the financial, the political, all of those. And I think there's been a deconstruction going on amongst believers around the whole understanding of politics, finance, and religion, to actually renew our minds to the truth of what God is really saying. Jesus warned of the leaven of Herod and Pharisees. Jesus didn't come to establish a political kingdom. He very clearly said, my kingdom is not of this world, and I'm not coming to give the kingdom back to Israel so Israel can rule the world. Now, that's what actually is an agenda behind a lot of things, that there will be a kingdom that rules the world. But actually, God's kingdom is a kingdom which spreads not by violence, but through peaceful infiltration as people's lives are changed, like leaven leavens the lump. And yeah, there's a bit of kneading that goes on to get leaven to leaven the whole lump, and you've got to sort of, but it's not violence. You're not committing violence against the dough. You're looking to knead it in such a way that it actually rises, and in the end. So we sort of have a sort of taken that, what Jesus said about how the kingdom would advance and fill the earth, and we've turned it into all sorts of different ideas. If you enjoy these videos, would you please take a moment to like, comment, and subscribe? It really does help. Thank you very much.